Welcome to Restoring Education in America with Priscilla Ron. She's a master educator and author, leading the conversation to restore the American mind through wisdom, virtue, and truth.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Restoring Education in America. I'm your host, Priscilla Ron, and I'm so excited that you decided to join the conversation today. I have my really dear friend who is an amazing educator, and she is the Honorable Miss Lori Garcia Sander as my guest today. Hi, Lori.
Hi.
I'm so glad that we are having a conversation. We talk quite a bit because you are an educator and you are in the state legislature here in Colorado. But before we go too much further, I'm going to share your bio with the listeners. Today, my guest is Mrs. Lori Garcia Sander. She is a common sense conservative, former public school teacher and administrator, and lifetime resident of Northern Colorado. And she's ready to help bring back common sense to the state legislature and take on the far left Democrats who control the legislature. Lori was raised in LaSalle, Colorado, with one older brother and two younger sisters, and graduated from Valley High in Gilchrist. Her dad was a union carpenter in Denver, and her mom was a homemaker. Lori worked at a bank and traveled through Asia and Europe during her college years, and then started employment in teaching and administration in Weld and Larimer counties. Lori is a proud public school educator, having taught kindergarten through 12th grades. And that was an English language acquisition as a second language. And at various times during her teaching career, that's what she did. Additionally, Lori has served as an administrator at the elementary school and district levels, and she has supervised student teachers throughout her career. Lori married her husband, Will, in 2005, and they live in Eaton and have a 198 tree apple orchard. During good years, they sell apples at the local farmers market. And Will retired from teaching 9 years ago and has a small business selling vintage auto parts. Lori and Will also own property in Red Feather Lakes that they lease for cattle grazing. They love traveling in their vintage cars and Airstream trailers. And that's just to name a few things that you do. So welcome again. I honestly, I had put you in a box. I thought you were just an educator, quote unquote, just an educator, and a state rep, but I had no idea you were a farmer rancher and all the cool things and vintage cars. That is very cool. So what kind of apples do you raise or grow?
We actually, so about 3/4 of the orchard is Honeycrisp, and then we've got Gala, Harrelson, Ruby Mac, Liberty, and Early Fuji, besides the Honeycrisp. So
That's
handful of others.
Okay, so I remember years ago, I wanted to make the quote unquote best apple pie. And there are all these theories about which apple makes the best apple pie. Do you have a theory about which apple is the best?
And I forgot one more is Cortland. And we actually had a gal who stopped by, and we have two or three Cortland trees. And she's from Pennsylvania. And she said, growing up, they only used Cortland apples for pies. And she said, I can't get them here. So we have them shipped out. I have a box shipped out every year from Pennsylvania so that I can get my Cortland apples for pies. So we use them for pollinators for the Honeycrisp, but they're so pretty. They look like a Sleeping Beauty apple. They're red with almost a little bit of a purpley hue, and they've got a little bit of green and a little yellow, kind of a little glimmer on them, and they're just so pretty. And when you cut them, the flesh is white and they stay white. They don't yellow or brown. And so apparently Cortlands are really good for apple pies. However, my mom, she's the baker in the family, and we use Honeycrisp for everything. We use Honeycrisp for pies, for sauce. We make at the end of the season, we take, what we have left and we press cider, and then we turn a lot of that into hard cider. And Honeycrisp is just a really good all-purpose apple for everything.
So what's the season that you sell?
We start picking usually about the third week in August, and we start with the Honeycrisp, and we end with the Fuji apples, and we pick Fuji about the beginning of October.
Okay, so now I know where to go to get my authentic source of apples. Okay, which kind of ties into the fact that you're a teacher and the whole image of teachers and apples. So you have taught from kindergarten through 12th grade, including ESL, which is English Language Acquisition, for those who may not know. And then you later served as an administrator and supervised student teachers. You have a uniquely broad perspective in the system. In your view, what's the single biggest misconception policymakers might have about what happens in our schools?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's funny because the entire time I was a teacher or a principal or working at the district office, people would ask me about what was going on in the legislature. My husband has always volunteered or worked on campaigns. He worked for a congressman for a short while, and so we've always been connected, and I always paid attention to what policies were coming out of the state and federal legislatures that were affecting education. And teachers would ask me, why do we have to start doing this? Why do we have to stop doing that? And I would always say, write your state legislator, write your federal congressman, because they don't know what we're actually doing in schools. They have no concept about what it really looks like to have to manage the policies that I think a lot of times are well-meaning, they're well-intended. Nobody wants to go and write a law or a policy that's going to burden teachers or burden families or burden children. Most things come from a really well-intended place, but people that are writing the laws don't actually walk in the shoes of teachers or principals or district administrators, and they don't know the domino effect of what they think is a simple policy, what that might mean to the actual burden, or the paperwork, the enactment, the teacher time, the actual end product of over testing or too much paperwork, that kind of thing. So I would say, the biggest thing is that most policymakers don't have a clue about what we do as teachers and principals in the schools.
It's really refreshing to have an educator down at the state capitol. And thank you again for writing your thoughts for my book, Restoring Education in America. You have some really great thoughts that are on the outside back cover of my book. And I hear this a lot in politics. It's like, oh, you're just a teacher. And I say that tongue in cheek because I don't think people really understand how our brains work and how we think and how organized we are as educators and what it takes to plan and to assess and to track the things that we do. It's just really incredible that you're there, because I know on the Democrat side, I looked at the careers on the Democrat and Republican side, and there are more licensed educators on the Democrat side down at the Capitol than there are on our side. And for so long, I thought that was a disadvantage for us because they would pass all of these, bills that I didn't feel like really address the needs in our school system. In the last legislative session, you voted for a really incredible bill around financial literacy. It was House Bill 25-1192, which requires high school students to accomplish a certain level in financial literacy. Interestingly enough, in my school district, our students in the middle school were tested in their, they're called interims. And the teachers were very upset because they said, we don't even have any curriculum to teach our students financial literacy, but they're being assessed on it. I mean, this is a really critical thing for our students to learn. Why did you support that bill? Why was that bill important for you?
It's interesting because I was a no vote on that almost the entire time it was working its way through the legislature, primarily because I believe in local control. And I believe that there are a lot of schools that already have in place processes and a curriculum for teaching kids financial literacy, starting with a Meritown in fourth grade and fifth grade in elementary schools. A lot of our schools across the state go to a Meritown, or they have a Meritown come through, and really it teaches kids basic economics. Kids apply for jobs, they run stores and shops, and they pay and are paid, and it's really economics 101 for fourth and fifth graders. I believe that local control is the most important thing for our schools in our state, and we're blessed to have that in Colorado. Not all states have that. So I really was resistant on this idea that we have to have a statewide mandate to teach kids financial literacy. The bill got pared back a lot from what it was initially, meaning that by the time kids graduate, so in 11th or 12th grade, they should have some coursework that is financial literacy, meaning that I think when it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it, because when we were in school, often in high school, sometimes in middle school, we had home ec, or family, career, and consumer sciences is what home ec became, where we learned how to balance a checkbook and write a budget, and kind of economics we learned in math class, in middle school and high school, and a lot of that has kind of fallen to the wayside. I think primarily because we overtest and we are focused on reading, writing, and basic math skills and science to some degree. We're not really teaching all of the practical skills anymore. And again, that used to start in middle school. I'm a huge advocate for us as a state, reenacting some of those things that were like home ec and shop skills that were basic kind of. Now they call it adulting 101. It's really funny because middle schools and high schools have this class called adulting 101, which is where they are supposed to learn how to read a recipe and sew a button on and balance a checkbook. But a lot of people say, well, we don't use checkbooks anymore. When was the last time you wrote a check? And so we don't balance ledgers anymore. And so that financial literacy piece, I think, was really kind of a hard sell for me, thinking, a lot of this parents should be responsible for. We have pieces that are already in curriculum, but the fact of the matter is we do have kids that are graduating from high school that don't have the skills. And the frustrating part, I think, as educators, as public school educators, as conservative public educators, is so often we want parents to take the reins on their children's education. We think parents are their first best educators, and that's a responsibility. Unfortunately, the government has done a great job of taking that responsibility of parents away from parents over the last 30, 40 years. And so we are on our third generation of parents that truly don't know how to parent. We have parents who don't know how to balance checkbook, who don't manage their finances, who don't know how to teach their children financial literacy. And then it's like, if not them, then who? And we are in this place of, we have kids who graduate from high school, graduate from college, and they don't understand the implications of taking out student loans and what that means when they have, 10, 20, 30 years of loans, and what that means when they have to pay those loans back. And, how are they going to buy a car, or how are they going to, afford a house someday? Again, we grew up in a time where our parents taught us a lot of those skills. And I don't know about you, but I grew up on a lot of beans and rice and potatoes and spaghetti, because my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and that was really important to her. That was a priority. We didn't have brand new cars. We didn't take a lot of vacations. They managed their money. And, those were skills that I learned from my parents. But we have parents now who don't have those skills. They don't have them. And so again, if we don't teach them in school, their parents aren't going to, because they don't have those skills. So it was a hard sell for me. But at the end of the day, the bill sponsor convinced me that by paring it back to by 11th, 12th grade, if we can condense it to a semester of instruction or if schools can prove that they've got enough coursework across some classes that show that students have some financial literacy basics, that would suffice for their graduation requirement.
Yeah, that's really smart, that analysis that you have, because we don't want to take the power away from parents or be too intrusive, philosophically. Like, we think, what is the proper role of government when it comes to education? And so I think that's really thoughtful and very practical. And I mean, I think a lot of parents would say, I would rather my students learn about financial literacy than some of the other things that are creeping into our schools that we really need to watch out for. I know one of the bills I testified on, there are so many state standards, and we don't have time to teach them all, and we don't get assessed on them. And so from my standpoint as a classroom teacher, we don't need any more standards, because we're not even teaching them with fidelity right now. It's almost criminal, and there's no way to enforce the fact that standards aren't being taught in our districts. But if you're just now tuning in, my guest today is Representative Lori Garcia Sander. She's an educator and a Republican state rep. Now, you live in a district that has a very unique funding process for schools. Tell us about how you fund schools in your county and in your district.
So actually, when we were talking earlier, it's not my district where I live now. It's 5 miles to the north. It's a district where I still work very part-time on contract. And I'll back up a little bit, because last year, about this time, I was speaking with our school superintendent about school funding. And at the time, we were one of 10 school districts in the state that were self-funded. Self-funding meaning that we don't get state funds. We don't get extra state funds for our students for our per pupil operating revenue. We get money for our title programs, but not for the PPOR, because we have our oil and gas severance tax revenue that is sufficient in our district, that it outweighs that need for the state to backfill and fund our district. Last year at this time, we were 1 in 10 school districts that were self-funded. This year, there are 3 school districts that are self-funded. And I tell people all the time, the reason that oil and gas is so important to Colorado is because of that severance tax revenue. When we cut off oil and gas revenues, the plan is by 2030, we're going to not issue any more permits. When we cut off oil and gas revenue, that means there's less money, less revenue going into our general fund, which funds our state education programs. To go from 10 fully self-funded school districts that were not reliant on the state funding to run their basic school programs, to go from 10 to 3 in 1 year is a significant impact, not only on the state budget, because now the state has to put in more to the state funding for those extra 7 districts, but in the long run, I don't know, how this is going to turn out as far as the severance tax for the next year to come. But, if we have the final 3 school districts that are no longer able to be self-funded, that means we're a burden on the state funding, the overall general budget funding for our state public ed system. So that's something a lot of people don't realize, is that connection between oil and gas, the severance tax revenues, and how it affects school districts.
That is so critical to know. And I know a lot of people are paying attention to the tax increases, property tax increases. Does that mean that for those districts that don't have that revenue from oil and gas, that their property taxes are going to have to go up in order to fill the gap for funding our schools?
So yeah, because ultimately the state's going to have to backfill the money that we are no longer going to be funding, because our tax revenues, our severance tax revenues, are going to go down. State has to backfill those, which means that our local property taxes are going to increase in order to help supplement that property tax increase.
This is critical for the public to know what bad policies can do that hurts everyday people. Colorado has been known to be an ag and oil and gas state, that we've lost so many businesses because we're not friendly to these businesses anymore. And so it does hurt the average everyday, small farmer, right? Or
Yeah.
homeowner. So, elections have consequences. We desperately need to turn Colorado around so we can attract these businesses back again. I mean, to think that there won't be any more contracts after a certain point in our state, and we're so rich in oil and gas and agriculture. It's people need to wake up, is all I'm saying. We need to wake up.
Yeah, it's almost like I don't know what the pain point is going to be for people to really understand the impact of the policies that have been enacted over the last 7 years.
Well, you kind of alluded to it, going back to the things we learned a long time ago, like home ec. I mean, I learned how to make an apron, and I learned how to make ice cream, and I learned how to sew, and all of these little basic things that are very, very practical. Our students don't. I mean, our students don't know how to tell time. They don't know how to write in cursive. But I know that you are a big supporter of career and technical education and having a pipeline for students to go into these skilled trades. So what role do you think the legislature plays in making sure that we bring that back, with more fidelity?
I'll go back to talking about local control. And so, I hate the idea of the legislature enacting anything that's going to say, you must now teach home ec, you must now teach shop, because I think we need to incentivize districts to do that. I think potentially taking money from programs that aren't necessary and perhaps funneling them into incentives for teachers to go into those career fields, to teach CTE classes, and for schools to provide spaces to do that. I think that's a really good possibility. But I think the tides are turning. For so long, we had, we have to have college and career ready. And there was so much emphasis on college ready. And we want all kids to be able to have the opportunity to go to college. And that means they have to take these classes or those classes. I think the opportunity for us is huge in Colorado, because I think kids now are finding they've heard too much about student loan debt. And so they're not exactly graduating high school saying, I want to jump into college. And I always tell parents of high schoolers or middle schoolers, if your child wants to go into a profession where they must have a degree, they want to be an attorney, they want to be a doctor, they want to be a teacher, they want to be an engineer. Those are things that, I would encourage them to go the college track, make sure they apply for all the things, all the scholarships. But there are so many opportunities. We have HVAC openings like crazy. There, you can't find an HVAC person, a plumber, an air conditioning service person who's available, and is affordable. They're all, an apprentice is making $60 an hour for a journeyman, an apprentice who maybe doesn't even have a college degree, usually a high school degree. They can apprentice, they can journeyman, they can find that path, and within a few years they're making six figures with zero student loan debt. So I think incentivizing schools to provide opportunities for kids to investigate and learn about other career paths is really important. I don't know that, I want the legislature to come out and say, we need standards now, so kids have to learn shop and home ec. But I also always will say, I can operate power tools because I took shop in middle school, and that was a requirement. All of us in middle school, we had to have a semester of shop and a semester of home ec in 7th and 8th grade. All the guys in my 7th and 8th grade classes learned how to read a recipe and sew on a button and learn how to thread a sewing machine. And all the girls learned how to use a drill press and how to use a lathe and how to use a bandsaw and drills. And, so those are valuable, practical life skills. And I hope that, that as schools find that CTE is, kind of a wave of the future, and we're looking at high school, well, we should be looking at that in middle school. I know a lot of kids that I went to school with in middle school, that's where they found their passion, in shop or home ec. There were people that really got a bang out of accounting, learning how to balance a ledger in 7th grade. And, they went on to be accountants. And we had, guys that were really into the whole shop, the mechanical pieces, the drafting, and they went on to, go into, to diesel mechanics and automotive tech kind of jobs, and opening up shops of their own. And so there's huge opportunities when we expose kids to the possibilities of different career tracks in the middle school years. So I hope that we can incentivize that down the road, and maybe, like I said, shift some money from some unnecessary programs to incentivize schools to do that.
Well, I remember as a young teacher getting my oil changed at the high school where I taught for free because the kids had to learn how to change the oil. We are almost out of time here. We have to land our plane. I know it's like the time goes by so fast, and we're having a great conversation. Real quickly, though, in about a minute or less, with President Trump, signing his executive order ending the Department of Education, what does that mean for you at the state level?
It's so funny because I told people that since I was a baby teacher, 30 years ago, I said, I would love if the Department of Education would just go away. I've been saying that for 30 years because there's so much bureaucracy, and money that we send up to the federal government for education gets eaten up in so much bureaucracy at the federal department. They send money down to the state department, and because the state department has to manage the federal and state programs, that money gets eaten up in bureaucracy at the state department. It gets sent down to the districts, and districts have to have bureaucracies because they have to report for state and federal money. And so districts have bureaucracy, and we have to hire people that have to manage that, and money gets eaten up in the bureaucracy there. So by the time it actually gets down to Johnny, my little student, my Johnny, or my Juan, who needs ESL in kindergarten, that money that was probably, $10,000 per child that we sent up to the federal government is now like maybe $2,500 for that child's education. So I'm really okay with the federal Department of Ed going away. A lot of the federal requirements, like special education, like English as a second language, there's federal law that requires states and schools to provide services. So those services aren't going to go away. Hopefully that means just that the money's not going to the federal Department of Ed, the money's staying at the state level, and the state's going to manage those programs, send money back to the districts and the schools. And so there's less bureaucracy that's eating up that money. Hopefully that means I get more money from my Juan in kindergarten to teach him English language development.
Well, there you have it from the Honorable Representative Lori Garcia Sander. She's a Colorado state rep. She's a Republican conservative educator. Thank you so much for your time today and your wisdom. We'll have to do a part 2 for sure. But to my list, thank you. And so for my listeners, thank you so much for joining me today. Catch me next time. And remember, educating the mind without the heart is no education. So seek wisdom, cultivate virtue, and speak truth.
Thanks for tuning in to Restoring Education in America with Priscilla Ron. Visit PriscillaRon.com to connect or learn how you can sponsor future episodes to keep this message of faith, freedom, and education on the air.